Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about 2 soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is Joe DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games they come from without getting too bogged down in music theory. Joe, what are this week's games?
Up first is a game about wandering from coast to coast in Great Depression-era America, telling and hearing the stories of the people around you, 2018's Where the Water Tastes Like Wine.
Following that is 2011's Deus Ex Human Revolution, a prequel to a stealth shooter PC classic where bodily enhancements and cybernetics are the way forward, and difficult decisions follow with those ethics. It has been a while since we have had 2 such polar opposite games in terms of the soundtracks. Great soundtracks, don't get me wrong. However, you listen to 2 songs back to back and it's like, yeah, those are exceedingly different. So it's difficult to come up with a theme, but I think they didn't ask for this is most appropriate.
Yeah, whether it be the meme line from Adam Jensen, the one thing that everybody knows about Human Revolution, whether they've played it or not. Or, Great Depression. No one asked for that.
Marginalized groups especially.
Yeah, especially. So, yeah, I think that's fairly appropriate. I think it works out.
I agree. Joe, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing all right. As you can see, I finally broke down and did my first quarantine self-beard trim. I don't know how well it worked out. I don't usually trim my own beard because I'm afraid I will screw it up. So I take the hit and I just have somebody else do it for me. But obviously that's not an option right now. And my beard was getting really long and scraggly and itchy and it looked like crap. So just did it myself.
I can relate. I do some of that as well, but I don't know. Yeah, the hair, when it starts to get a little too long, that's going to get a bit dicey. Yeah, here in this unusual era of staying at home. Well, we do have some composer follow-up news. Hopefully your bunny day went well if you've been playing Animal Crossing New Horizons. But then again, you also didn't ask for all of the eggs these past couple weeks.
Where did the fish go, Zipper?
I'm sick of these water eggs. Composer follow-up news, though, here, when we talk about all the composers we've talked about on the show in the past. They keep working. They keep making new things. And we'd like to follow up on some of that news, at least when it makes, notable headlines. First of which being Yasunori Mitsuda. We talk about Sabotage's new game, Sea of Stars, the one that's kickstarted, hopefully for a 2021 release. They're the creators behind The Messenger. And their next game is seeming Chrono Trigger-like, as opposed to Ninja Gaiden-like for The Messenger. Well, who better to help Rainbow Dragon Eyes with the soundtrack than Yasunori Mitsuda, the composer behind Chrono Trigger? An amazing get. His quotes in the PR are just amazing. Like, he saw this game and he felt inspired to help in some way. And, Thierry Boulanger is a big fan, obviously inspired by Chrono Trigger growing up. So it just seems like an amazing match.
Yeah, I am now doubly as excited for this game as I was before. This is a great get, and I'm very interested to see what kind of sound comes out of it. Meanwhile, there is a 16-minute video feature on FF7 Remake's music and sound effects featuring Mitsuto Suzuki. If you're listening to this, it's very likely you've already started playing Final Fantasy VII, and I wish I could say the same, but in our timeline, it hasn't come out yet. It's preloaded onto my PS4, and I have to stare longingly at the icon. But I always love when companies release like these little featurettes on their music, and the sound design especially. You especially don't get that very often anymore. So really cool. Make sure to check that out. Good stuff.
Absolutely. I'm not sure when my physical version's coming in, but I'm playing Persona 5 Royal and Animal Crossing, so a little busy right now. And then I hear that the physical version has 2 discs. One of them is just a data dump disc, and the other is the one you play the game on.
Jeez.
We're at that point at the end of physical media in this generation. Holy cow. That's just wild. And then finally, Lena Raine is composing for Minecraft's Nether update she just announced today. So a good get for a composer that it's continually on the rise, continually doing cool new things. She's fantastic, and so is her music.
I don't know the details about the Nether update yet because I haven't looked into it. Minecraft is one of those things, one of those games where I play a good amount of Minecraft, but I'll take half-year to year-long breaks before I play again most of the time, and every time I come back, it's a completely different game.
And these kids on YouTube are all up to date with it, and they know every single thing because all their YouTube friends are really into it. So yeah, I've never breached that wall.
It's a big wall, a thick, big wall, but I didn't realize that they were still putting new music into the game. And Lena Raine doing music for Minecraft sounds like a match made in heaven. I'm down with it. Let's do it. And speaking of music, because that's what we do on this show, let's talk about our first game, which is a game that a lot of you might not have heard of pretty much ever, being Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Originally released for PC on February 28th, 2018, it also got a console release the following year on November 29th, 2019. I actually reviewed it, the Switch version, for Nintendo World Report. That's basically how I became familiar with the game, more than anything. It was developed by Dim Bulb Games and Serenity Forge and published by Good Shepherd Entertainment. In Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, you take control of a vagrant during the late 20s/early 30s in the United States. A lot was happening in the United States during this time period. Not a lot of it very good for very many people. Most notably, this is the era in which the time that we call the Great Depression took place. So let's do a quick history lesson. Otherwise, this section of the show could potentially last 15 minutes in general. And please remember, I'm not a historian. If you are actually super interested in the Great Depression era, I would heavily recommend you do your own research because it is a fascinating time period that just be glad you weren't alive then. That's all you should probably have to know. In the 20s, it was a huge time of excess in America. The Roaring 20s. It's one of my favorite time periods in American history, actually. I think it's a really cool setting in general for fiction.
You get all the flappers and you get all the the Charlestons.
Mm-hmm. It's and you get the mob because of Prohibition, and you get the great music of the 20s, etc. It's such a cool time period to put stuff in. And this was mainly because the economy was super cool and good after World War I, and people were spending as much money as they could, including money they did not actually have, because of the introduction of credit. And everybody's overuse of credit meant that they were buying way more than they could actually afford. And one thing that was doing incredibly well was the stock market. In fact, a lot of people that were involved in the stock market were like, man, it's never going to stop getting better. Oops, it did. On October 24th, 1929, the stock market began to crash, and crash hard. On October 29th, historically now known as Black Tuesday, share prices fell by $14 billion in one day. And this led to a massive period of financial hardship, not only for many Americans, but for many countries around the world, that we now call the Great Depression.
And that's $14 billion in 1920s money.
Yeah, who knows what that is in today's money? I don't even want to look up that number. It sounds daunting. There were a lot of other things going on during this period as well, like the Dust Bowl, the final years of Prohibition, which was when we outlawed alcohol. And overall, mainly history focuses on the Depression back in that time, and that's pretty much when the story of our game takes place. So again, I'm not a historian. I might have missed some details there. If you're really interested, go research it yourself. It's very interesting. So, one day you, a skeletal vagrant wandering the country, yes, I said skeletal, you are a skeleton in this game, step into a poker game and begin to play. Eventually, you and one other gentleman are the only ones left in the game, and your opponent offers you a deal. Instead of betting possessions, why not bet your life? You have a pretty good hand. In fact, you have the best hand you could possibly have in poker. I don't remember which hand that is. I just remember that the game specifically says the best hand you could possibly have.
A royal flush?
Yes, it is a royal flush. There we go. That's the one. So you decide to make that bet because you can't lose. There's no way. But then once you make that bet, you realize you've been duped. Your great poker hand is replaced by a set of tarot cards, meaning you weren't even playing the same game you thought you were. And the man in front of you is no human, but instead a wolf in a suit. He gives you your assignment. You must wander the country in search of stories to spread through oral recitation. And that's what you do. You wander the country, and you find stories. No, seriously, that's what you do in the game. You walk across America, or freight hop, or hitchhike. But the point is, you are wandering across the country, and that's the gameplay. Just walking. As you walk, you will wander into stories. For instance, the first story I ever wandered into was 2 women being arrested for bootlegging, which, for anybody that wouldn't know what that means, I don't know why you wouldn't, but just in case, it means that they were illegally transporting alcohol to sell. Once I witnessed this event, this story of it was added to my inventory. And then eventually you will bump into other wanderers, also walking around the country, each with their own stories and personalities, and your goal is to tell them the kind of stories that they want to hear, taken from the inventory of experiences that you have had throughout the game, gradually getting them to open up and tell you their true life stories in return. Your overall goal is to learn the stories of every character like this, which I believe there are 16 in total. And sometimes you will encounter somebody retelling a story you've already told to one of these characters, but with a few embellishments gained from the word of mouth that they have been using to get around. For instance, one of the first ones that I bumped into, eventually I bumped into somebody who was retelling the story of the bootlegging ladies. But in their version of the story, there was a shootout with the cops, which did not happen in the real story. But after hearing that, my character was like, that's pretty cool, and it adds some excitement to the story. Let's just tell it like that from now on. And that's basically the way that the game works. You just wander, you find these stories, you tell them, you find new versions of the stories, etc., etc., etc. And with that is where I am going to ask, what are your experiences with Where the Water Tastes Like Wine?
Before I answer that, I will answer the inflation question.
Oh, God.
How much $14 billion in 1929 would be in 2019, according to WestEgg.com's inflation calculator? $212 billion. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
So, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a game that sounds right up my alley. And I think if you've heard of this game, it may only be because of its reveal trailer at the Game Awards 2015. That was where like the teaser trailer was first shown for it. Otherwise, it's a game that, yeah, as you mentioned, like you may not know about this game. In fact, it may come to surprise some people when you mention that you do know of this game, because for me, even though I haven't played it, and I really should, it's a game that I'm oddly personally connected to. Not only do I know one of the writers on the game, as looks like your research will get to, but I also know one of the performers on the soundtrack. And not know them well, but
you've met them.
I've met them in a weird circumstance where I was in London in end of October 2018, and I was there on a business trip, but celebrating a friend's birthday at the same time, just by happenstance. They had a spare ticket to a Video Games Live concert, and went with them. I had a great time, but in line, someone was looking to see if there were extra tickets. And I got to talking with them, and we struck up a connection because we were Americans in England. She was from Los Angeles, studying in Oxford to get like a master's in music, I believe, as far as a vocal performer. And I was just there visiting for work. But just like, oh yeah, Americans in England, and so it made that connection. And it mentioned that she was a vocalist and that she did work on some video games. It's like, so any of them that I would know of. And she mentions, oh, there was Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. I'm like, oh, I've heard of that game. And it's like, you have, like,
even she was kind of surprised.
Right, exactly. So is that weird connection. And so there's that. And yeah, it feels like a game that with all these weird little connections, they're like, I need to play this game. I really do. There's so many great games out there, but it seems like one that's up my alley, but just one I'm not familiar with personally with hands-on experience.
For me, I am mainly familiar with this game because I reviewed it for Nintendo World Report. I had heard the name before, and I believe I remember that reveal trailer as well. But for the most part, I didn't know how it played. I didn't know what it was about, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I played it, I didn't finish it, but I do think that it is a very unique and interesting concept for a game. It is one that I am planning to go back to at some point. I just really haven't had a chance. And yeah, I do agree that I think it sounds like something that would be up your alley. It's definitely up mine.
Mm-hmm.
It's entirely narrative driven. I think my one problem with it is it takes like, how long to beat puts it at like 8 hours. I don't know if the gameplay really holds up for 8 hours, but I've only played like 3 or so hours of it. So, I mean, I guess I would have to see. But yeah, it's mainly just that it's unlike any other game I've ever played, for better or for worse. And yeah, it's one that I really have to get back to, but it's also one that I think has among the better indie game soundtracks I've ever heard. So let's get on into the rest of it so we can get to listening to some of that soundtrack. So, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine's main concept was created by, and I'm so sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Jonaman Nordhagen, who had previously been a lead programmer on the successful indie game Gone Home. Which, after Gone Home had such a great critical reception, it kind of encouraged him to go and strike out and figure out his own concept for a game that he could do himself. And according to him, according to an interview I was able to find, the concept itself mainly stemmed from him taking a backpacking trip across Europe and Asia very shortly after Gone Home released. And he found that he was bumping into a lot of the same people at like the hostels and stuff like that throughout his whole journey. And every night they would sort of just sit down and they would swap stories of like, hey, this happened to me in this area, and this, watch out for this place, I got my pocket picked in this area, and et cetera, et cetera. And he started to think about how he could like mix this idea with another love of his being American roots music, stuff like jazz, bluegrass, country, stuff like that. And somehow, he didn't really specify how, this led him also to taking his mind to the Depression era. So he began to research the kind of people that lived the hobo lifestyle. Speaking of, very recently learned that hobo actually means a very specific thing, which I didn't know. Hobo, the name comes from the fact that some of these people were hopping rails to follow farming seasons. So they would ride the rails to a different part of the country, be like, hey, farmer dude, I will hoe your fields. All you got to do is pay me. I'll hoe the fields and then I'll be gone. And they would do that, and that's how they would get their work. And when the farming season ended, they would hop on a train and head to the next place.
Wow.
So that's why they're called hobos. I didn't know that until very recently. So that's a really interesting piece of trivia for you. He realized that just writing about white male hobos probably wasn't going to be good enough for not only this day and age of the 2010s, I guess at the time, but also like the day and age of the Depression, because guess what? There were more people back then too. They didn't just sprout out of nowhere recently. So this led him to the conclusion, as he was like coming up with concepts for these characters, that he was not the right person to write all these characters. Quote, I had a black sharecropper from the South, and I sat down and I was like, I can't write this character. I can't write about the Native American experience. There's all these other people that I'm not the right person to tell those stories. And so I began thinking about getting other writers to help me, and very quickly that turned into the idea of just getting one person to write each character, because that was something I don't think any game has ever done before, and it was an idea that really seemed fascinating to me. And so he did that. He reached out to several other writers throughout the industry, 16 in total, including people like Motherboard's Cheetah Jackson, Emily Short, former Gamasutra editor Lee Alexander, Austin Walker, and more, including a familiar name if you've been following Peter's older work in the past. Like you mentioned, you know one of the writers of this game.
I do, yeah.
It is none other than Jordan Miner, who old school fans of Show Me Your News might recognize as Piffman 2. From way back in 2007. Like, that was a while ago.
We're old when internet handles defined us then.
Oh, yeah. Jordan apparently currently works for PC Mag and formerly wrote for Geek.com. And he helped establish the Ziff Davis Creators Guild Union. So that's what he's been up to since the Show Me Your News days. Jordan apparently wrote the character Franklin, who's actually one of the characters I met during my time with the game. I actually only met 3, 4, maybe 5 of the other Wanderers, and Franklin happens to have been one of them. So that's really cool. Franklin is an African-American man working as a Pullman porter, which was an occupation held by many black men in the post-Civil War era. I believe, from what I gathered from how Franklin described it, it was basically working for the postal system, like moving rather large stuff for the railroads and stuff like that. I don't know. I don't remember the full details of what that was, but yeah, that was one thing that was very interesting that we learned while you actually brought it to me this morning at time of recording.
Yeah, it was really cool. So I've been following Jordan's career from a distance for a while now. We've been following each other on Twitter for a very long time. It makes me think, oof, 2007 was that podcast episode. Yeah, that's kind of crazy. But knowing that he did contribute to Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, and knowing I had that connection, and oh yeah, we had this podcast recording coming up. I'm like, I've never asked him like what he actually did on the game. And so, yeah, put it out there and wanted to know what his experience was like. And yeah, I really appreciate his help. So thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you very much. According to him and many other sources that I was able to find, including Johanneman himself, the process started with him coming up with a concept for the character, and then he would give various amounts of detail. According to Johanneman, it sort of varied depending on the character, how much detail that he gave to the writer beforehand. And then he would do huge amounts of research to figure out various events in smaller parts of the era that might have been forgotten that he wanted to highlight. And then he would reach out to the various writers so that they could put together the various emotional responses for each character, and also work to flesh out the characters so that they had an authentic perspective on the struggles of those people during the time period. One quote that he gave to sort of describe how he would end up coming out with a character, he said, quote, I knew that I wanted to have, for example, something about the miner wars of the early 20th century. This was the thing in the U.S. where miners, coal miners, went on strike and the U.S. government fought them, and it was a big deal. I took that as a starting point. I did a lot of historical research into that, and then I would collect all those notes that I had and all that research and send it to a writer, and they would take the historical context and actually make a person out of it. Because all I had was like, oh yeah, these are the dates in which this happened, and so on and so forth. That's how it ended up. Every single other traveler that you meet is written by a different writer, and so they all feel like completely different people. And it's very cool, and I think it works out really, really well.
Especially for this kind of game, I feel like you need those different voices.
Very much so, because he definitely tried to make sure that he was giving as much respect and time to voices that you don't hear about a lot from that era. Perspectives that you don't get a lot from like history books and stuff. Like Native American experience he mentioned earlier. You don't hear a lot about that from the Great Depression. Or, you know, like the Great Depression was really close to the Civil War. People forget that, but people were alive during the Great Depression that fought in the Civil War. Like, that's nuts to think about. So it's this whole like amalgamation of perspectives that maybe you didn't get in the past. And I do think that part of this game would have a pretty all right place in schools in some ways. I don't think you could base a curriculum around it because it's got a lot of fantastical elements too. I know one of the stories I bumped into was about seeing the Jersey Devil. Like that obviously isn't real, but this does present a lot of perspectives that you wouldn't get otherwise. And I think that's really neat and interesting and well done. Another neat detail I found is the reasoning for why the player is presented as a skeleton. I guess at first their plan was to have it start really like grounded and realistic and then slowly get weirder as time went on. But I guess they dropped that because it's like a weird mix of weird and grounded and all that. But it's also because Yoneman didn't want to make a character creator. He specifically points that out. And then he sort of realized that he wanted anybody to be able to pick up and play the game by inserting themselves into the traveler, no matter who they were. Quote, I just had this revelation at one point. Hey, if we make the player a skeleton, then that could be a stand-in for anyone. Like, everyone's got a skeleton. I love that quote. More than I love my cat. And then another big standout part of this game is the voice cast, because it is very interesting and varied and great. Much of the game is spent listening to the very well done narration of Keith Farley, who has a buttery smooth voice that I almost thought was Sam Elliott when I first played. It sounds very similar to him. And he just knocks it out of the park. But the cast also includes talent like RFS Kinshin, Dave Fennoy, Jacob Burgess, Melissa Hutchison, Kimberly Brooks, Sarah Elmala, and much, much more. But there is one part that is the most interesting, towering above all of this, and that is the direwolf at the very beginning, who sets you off on your journey in the first place, is voiced by the musician Sting. Apparently, when asked how in the world that happened, Yoneman says, A, he has absolutely no idea, but also then tells the story that somebody at their publisher happened to be at a party that Sting was at and floated the idea of the game to him, and he liked it so much that he was immediately on board and apparently extremely excited to be part of the project. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine was reviewed generally favorably, though due to its incredibly niche nature, because make no mistake, this game is super niche. Some publications gave it much lower scores than others. For example, Game Informer gave it a 9 out of 10, while Edge gave it a 5 out of 10.
Oh.
So there are a couple variations there. I think GameSpot gave it a 6. A lot of other things were around a 7 or an 8. At IndieCade 2017, the game was awarded with the Developer's Choice Award and was nominated for several other awards at places like South by Southwest, IGF, and Gang. But unfortunately, all of this attention and award winning didn't exactly do it any favors, and Where the Water Tastes Like Wine was sadly a massive commercial flop. Like, huge. In a post-mortem that Yoneman wrote, he basically said that he couldn't give any exact numbers, but less people had bought the game than followed him on Twitter. And at that time, he had a little over 4,000 followers.
Oh, man.
So the game never broke even, as far as I'm aware. I don't think he made any money on it, unfortunately. That might have changed with the console releases. I don't know. None of that information seemed to be super up to date. But yeah, it's kind of unfortunate. A lot of really dumb people believe it is because it was gamers standing up to the SJWs and beating them. No, man. It's just because the game was niche. The gameplay is not for everybody, and it's super niche. And it's just, sometimes games aren't for you.
Why are gamers sometimes the worst?
I don't know about sometimes. I think it's most of the time. But like, legit, if you enjoy like a very narrative and slow experience, because this is not a fast-paced, exciting experience. It is one that you is probably most well suited to play for an hour, set it down, come back later, play for another hour, etc., etc.
It's like reading a book.
Kind of, yeah. You should honestly check this game out. It's not very expensive. I think it's like $15 pretty much everywhere. And from what I played, I was certainly intrigued by it, and I do plan to go back to it at some point. And it just kind of sucks that the game had to flop as hard as it did. But let's get into some brighter areas and talk about the composer for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, Ryan Ike. Some background info on Ryan Ike, because I did manage to find a little bit, but he seems to be a fairly new person in the industry, so he doesn't have a huge amount of information on himself out there. As a kid, he always knew that he wanted to do something with music, even though that idea was, in his own words, very amorphous and not really clear what he meant by that. As he put it, he was like, do I want to perform? Do I want to write? Do I want to play? What do I want to do? What is my goal here? All he knew was that he had been smitten by music growing up to a great degree, especially that of Nobuo Uematsu's work in the Final Fantasy franchise. So a little connection to last week, talking about Final Fantasy VII. He didn't realize that what he wanted to be was a composer until he finished college. Despite studying music all throughout high school and college, once he graduated, he was like, you know what? I want to write my own music. That's what I want to do. And then he went to grad school, according to him, mainly out of fear of not wanting to dive into the real world quite yet. Understandable and relatable. But this did manage to give him more experience working with live performers and arranging music. Though he says he absolutely hated the type of music that his grad school wanted him to write, because he felt like it was all weird and experimental and at the same time kind of samey, and he just didn't enjoy it. He didn't want that. And so this inspired him to be like, no, when I leave, I have to try writing for video games. Because as he put it, it was either that or be bummed all the time. So he began networking on social media and at events, and eventually found himself working on the indie game Gunpoint, which my roommate is a huge fan of. In fact, he is, after bringing it up during a conversation earlier, he is playing it right now. Like on the other side of this wall, he is playing it. So he's a huge fan of that game. This is where he considers his career to have actually began. Another note that I found that I wanted to bring up was his favorite game soundtrack, and one of his favorite games of all time is Katamari Damacy, which means this man has some damn good taste.
Absolutely.
So his discography is not a lot. This is the stuff I could find based on what's on his Bandcamp page. He did the soundtrack for Gunpoint, which I mentioned earlier. West of Loathing, which was a game that released a couple years ago. Glittermitten Grove, which of course is the game that was secretly Frog Fractions 2, which he did the music for as well.
Oh, wow.
And then he also did two games that I'm not familiar with. One called Shiny and the other called Devouring Stars. I'm not familiar with either one of those, but they're on his Bandcamp page, so I figured they were worth mentioning in some way. For some development research of the soundtrack itself, Ike became involved with the project due to meeting Yoneman at a PAX West specifically. And after chatting a bit, Ike ended up being brought on as the main composer of the game. He was brought on very early into the project and was given plenty of early builds, written character concepts from all the writers, and concept art to work off of, which he says was very good because he believes that a lot of games bring in audio workers far too late when they should really be thinking about audio from the start.
Yep.
He said Yoneman would even send him YouTube videos of music that was similar to what he was looking for. Quote, I wanted to do something really diverse and varied because it's a game that's supposed to be about how diverse America is and how different people are struggling to find the American dream in different ways. I didn't want everything to be the same sound, so you have some bluegrass, blues, slug guitar folk, but there's also a string quartet piece and some Big Ben jazz and music that's supposed to reflect Navajo culture, which was the main drive of the soundtrack was variety, because that's the theme of the game is variety and the variety of people that live in the country and the different experiences that they all have. When searching for singers, because this game has a huge amount of vocal pieces, which we will hear very soon, the ones he came up with were a mixture of people he already knew and artists he had dug through the internet to find. He says he never had to ask for a second take. Vocalists featured on this soundtrack include Akenya, Joshua Duchesne, Jillian Aversa, Elizabeth Zaroff, May Claire LaPlante, and Jose Daniel Ruiz.
And if you are curious, Miss LaPlante is the one that I met in London.
Well, there you know. I believe he mentioned that she was one of the ones he knew beforehand. Other performers on the soundtrack include Cody Richards on flute, Jeff Ball and Max Wolpert on fiddle, John Robert Matz on trumpet, Kristen Nigas on oboe, Michael Begay on the Navajo flute, and the Videri String Quartet. So that's enough talking about that. It's time to hear what this game sounds like, because no description I give could possibly do it justice. And we're going to start with our 5 critical tracks. First one is Breathe the Black. So this song features guitar and mandolin by Joshua Duchesne, which, get used to that name, you're going to hear it a lot. This song mostly sticks out to me because it was one of the first songs I heard once the game actually started. And it might be scripted to actually be that way. But I heard this song a lot too. So basically the way music mainly works in this game is as you're walking, different songs will just play. They're not really, most of them aren't really connected to anything specific. Characters have their own songs that will play while you're talking to them, but other than that, it's basically a playlist that plays as you're walking. And I don't know, this song like really hits home with me. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's this fantastic guitar piece. And yeah, I think this is kind of the main thing to sort of expect from this soundtrack, mostly because like the quote from Mike said, there's a lot of variety to be found here too.
Oh, it's a great guitar piece. If I heard this early on in the game, it would probably be a favorite of mine as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. Now our next track is going to be weird because the next critical track number 2 is actually 5 critical tracks on its own. Because, bear with me. So the song is called Vagrant Song. And it's 5 tracks because a different version of this song plays depending on what part of the country you're in. And each one has its own flavor and tone. Again, there are 5 in total, so here we go. Let's get through them real quick. The first one is Deep South.
Well, I'm gonna scroll my name on the bare bones of the earth. I'm gonna dig my heels into the ground. 'Cause when that ferryman comes for to tally up my worth.
This one features vocals and guitar provided by Joshua Duchesne. It is the most low-key of all of them. It has this very melancholy feeling to it, I think. I think it's my favorite version of the song, just in general. Then you've got Appalachia.
Well, I'm gonna scroll my name on the bare bones of the earth. I'm gonna dig my heels into the ground. 'Cause when that ferryman come for to tally up my worth, I won't leave
once again featuring Joshua Duchesne on guitar, but also featuring Jeff Ball on fiddle and Jillian Aversa on vocals. It is a bluegrass version, which is much more upbeat, and what was a really melancholy piece before in the South is suddenly one that makes you feel like you gotta keep your chin up despite the hard times. Then you got Midwest.
Well, I'm gonna scroll my name on the bare bones of the earth. I'm gonna dig my heels into the ground. 'Cause when that ferryman...
This song features vocals by Elizabeth Zaroff, and it, I believe, according to Ike, it's supposed to be Scandinavian themed. Not 100% sure why that's the case, but I mean, it sounds good. It kind of feels like a fusion of the last two. It's not fully melancholy, but it definitely does not sound as upbeat as the Appalachian version does. Then you have Southwest.
Pues voy a rayar mi nombre en los huesos de la tierra. Clavaré mis tacones entre el suelo. Porque cuando...
Again, featuring guitar by Joshua Duchesne, vocals and translation by Jose Daniel Ruiz and May Claire LaPlante. And it's in Spanish, which it's definitely a second favorite on my end. And having it be a different language is just a really cool touch, because this is when you'd be in Texas and New Mexico and California and all those places that used to be Mexico. And then lastly, you have Northwest. And this song specifically was performed by the Videri String Quartet, featuring Lizzie Jones, Michael Husted, Rosalie Samter, and Jeremiah Barkis. It loses the vocals entirely, and yet still remains this incredibly good song that keeps the energy up. And apparently this song was one of Ike's earlier ideas for the soundtrack, with the idea being that, quote, as the music travels and it's shared with other musicians, it changes and takes on a life of its own. It's a lot of what this game is about.
What a great idea, especially if you're going to all these different regions. Just really cool, I think, especially for our listeners to hear, like, back to back, those differences in what is generally the same song, just with different flares to it.
Yeah, I legitimately did not know how I was going to cover this without just having all five of them be here. So, a little bit weird. But I think it fits thematically, and I think it's important that those five songs are all together in one place. Do you have one that really stood out to you?
I think I liked the same ones you did. Deep South as the first listen really did strike a chord, but yeah, hearing the translation in the Spanish version, that fits perfectly with that region of the country. Yeah, absolutely. I think those are the two really good calls there.
I think those are the biggest standouts of the soundtrack, but that does not mean that we are out of things to talk about, because track number 3 is Rail Hoppin'. Banjo, baby! Love the banjo. Mention it every time the banjo shows up on this show. This song, tell me if I'm crazy, almost feels like it has montage energy to it.
I see that. Yeah, for sure.
I feel like I should be watching a video of the traveler hopping on and off trains and walking alongside the road trying to find a ride, or spending time on the city streets, like while this song plays. It fits perfectly to that sort of thing. And honestly, every part of this song jives with me incredibly hard. I absolutely love this piece. It's one of my favorites that just plays out in the overworld.
It definitely makes me think, and we've talked about Supergiant games in the past. We'll talk about Supergiant games in the future, but kind of like a Darren Korb composition with like these kind of instruments. Yeah, I definitely see why you dig it so much. I think it sounds great. I think it's a good place to have it be here.
Yeah, I can definitely see the Supergiant connection, yeah. After that, critical track number 4, Soul Sucker Blues.
Well, I got a fire in me, don't come from up above. Yeah, I got debts to pay, but not the ones you're thinking of. And all of that fame and fortune bought me a hell of a lot to lose. Alright, but you ain't gonna hear me crying, 'cause I got that soul sucker blues.
This song features vocals by Akenya and guitar by Joshua Duchesne. Akenya's vocals are so good. She has such a cool voice. I think Ike, in one of his interviews, described her as like this sort of smoky aspect to her voice almost. And that is a good description. Like, she absolutely kills it in this song. And she sings one other song on the soundtrack, but it's not on the list, so unfortunately. But I did want to include her at least one time, and this is my favorite of the two she did. This style is not something you hear in games very often, I feel like. And I think that's what makes it feel so fresh and unique. And I don't remember if this is actually where it plays, but this song actually reminds me of the character Althea, who was an aspiring musician up to the point when she got scammed out of everything she had by a shady talent agent, giving her a bum contract.
You're right. It is not often that you hear a soulful performance like this, and it is great. I just wish the mixing were a little more favorable towards the vocals. To me, it sounds like the drums are a little heavy, and the vocals could be brought out a little more. But I love how it sounds. It's just if I had and it may be mixed that way for a certain purpose, but if I were mixing it, I'd bring those levels that way.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think I kind of agree that I wish it emphasized the vocalist a bit more, but at the same time, like, absolutely, I adore this song. I fought between this and one other song to go in this exact slot, and that song actually became the transition for reasons that we'll talk about when we get there. But yeah, this is probably, again, one of my favorite songs in the game. And speaking of one of my favorite songs in the game, critical track number 5 is Heavy Hands.
Well, I'll beat my drum till my last day come, or the mountain meets the sea. Yeah, the earth will shake, but the vow she break won't put no fear in me. 'Cause I see land on high, so I'll get my final line. Sky will shimmer and sun will shine, where the water tastes like wine.
Once again, this song includes guitar by Joshua Duchesne, but also vocals by Joshua Duchesne, as well as May Claire LaPlante, and fiddle by Jeff Ball and Max Wopert.
They all kill it here. Shouts out to all of them. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. Ike says that a lot of people like to point out that this song reminds them of Firefly.
Yeah.
He says, quote, "I always feel like an idiot because I love Firefly," and it does sound like that. From what I can tell, this comparison is not intentional. This is probably, I believe this is the song that was in the trailer.
Makes sense, yeah.
So it's probably the song that, if you have heard a song from this soundtrack, this is probably the one you heard. It's an absolutely beautiful piece where both of the vocalists absolutely kill it. Every player absolutely kills it, like you said. And the lyrics are also fantastic. I really, really jive with the line, "Well, stories end and I'm closing mine." It works perfectly. The song is fantastic. So, let's get into that cutting room floor, shall we? My first track is one that I wanted to put on because it's another one of those, like, you don't get this style of music in anything, really. And that is The Road Remembers. This song features Navajo flute provided by Michael McCann. And it is an example of some of the Native American influence that Ryan Ike tried to infuse into the game because, hey, they were having a real hard time back then, too. And before that, too, they were having a real hard time. They're a really important perspective to get, and they're a very important part of our culture, and they get overlooked a lot, unfortunately. And I think getting this sound in games, which again, you don't hear ever. Like, we mentioned that the Soul Sucker Blues is a type of song you don't hear in video games very often. This is a type of song you don't hear ever. So, very nice to see it here.
Yeah, tremendous to have it included. Very different, but it just makes you appreciate it that much more.
Mm-hmm. And then another one of my favorites that didn't quite make the list is Miles of Smiles. This is actually Franklin's theme, so this is the one that Jordan wrote. And this one always stuck out to me. Don't know why, I think it's just because it's a piano piece. And again, as we have established, like me a piano piece. So, great song.
I mean, obviously Ryan wrote the musical piece, but yes, good to tie it with Jordan's words for the character. Piano. What more can you say? It's a great little jazzy, like almost ragtime piece. Really neat. Again, like, to mash these up with these different styles really fits not only with the individual nature of the character, but also the different parts of the country and going through all these different struggles.
And it's actually named after what Franklin explains to you in game is the motto of the Pullman Porters, which is Miles of Smiles, always smile, never stop smiling. That was basically the main thing that they were told when they were working those jobs.
Real catchy, yeah.
So, what will I never forget about Where the Water Tastes Like Wine? It's a very unique experience that I think deserves more attention than it got, but I would be nuts to say that it is an experience that everybody would enjoy. It is not. Generally, it is not. I enjoyed it. I think you would enjoy it. I think a good amount of our friends would enjoy it, but I would not blame anybody for playing it and kind of getting bored and not wanting to play it any further. Honestly, that's just kind of how it goes, unfortunately. But more than anything, I think this is up there with one of the best soundtracks I've heard for a game in a very long time.
Wow.
Like, this soundtrack is absolutely fantastic. If you have not listened to it and any of these songs, like, struck a chord with you, absolutely go check it out. Go buy it on Bandcamp from Ryan Ike. It's fantastic. It's very, very good.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners got to enjoy the music they heard and appreciate it, because I know I sure did, hearing some of these songs for the first time. So, I feel like I gotta go play the game if I especially have these interpersonal connections with people related to the project.
Mm-hmm. So for our transition, we usually like to highlight a fan cover or remix from, say, YouTube or OC Remix. But for the first time since Florence, there are none. And that is shocking to me.
It's just that niche.
Nobody covered a single song from this soundtrack? That's nuts. So we're just going to include one more song from the game itself. It is called White Rider. It features guitar and vocals by Joshua Duchesne. It is the one that I was fighting with between it and Soul Sucker Blues to go in the Critical 5. So please enjoy that, and we will be right back.
White rider, ain't fixin' for to join your faded line. White rider, don't come to claim me for I had my time.
So, like we said, not sure how we're going to go from one game, like talking about America and the Great Depression and all the musical stylings there, to the worldwide cyberpunk future of Deus Ex. It's time to talk about Deus Ex Human Revolution, which is the third game released chronologically in the Deus Ex series. Deus Ex, a series that some people call as Deus Ex, Deus Ex, a whole bunch of other pronunciations. The Latin phrase Deus Ex translating out to God from. Generally, of course, you do hear it used with the phrase Deus Ex Machina. God from a machine is the literal translation there. But Deus Ex originally is a 2000 PC classic video game. Originally envisioned by Warren Spector over years of coming up with the concept. Like, I guess he originally came with the concept in like 1994. And then it took John Romero's Ion Storm development company to help piece this all together and get it just right for a 2000 release. It was like Game of the Year then for many places then. So Deus Ex, a very well-known game. It had a sequel in 2003 called Deus Ex Invisible War. Not as well received from fans and critics alike. From what I could tell, it was basically like just the definition of a sequel trying to recapture that magic, but it lacked Spector's vision and lacked all of that years in the making planning, and so it just wasn't as special. And then you get to Deus Ex Human Revolution, which was released on August 23rd, 2011 in North America for PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. Australia and Europe got the game on August 25th and 26th, respectively, so only just a couple days after. Now, Japan got the game on October 20th, 2011. It was originally planned to be released in September there, but it was delayed for about a month for initially having a 0Z rating. So their ratings board, a Z rating, is like our equivalent of adults only. So it had to go through some revisions before a Japanese release. There was a director's cut version of Deus Ex Human Revolution released on October 22nd, 2013 for Xbox 360, PS3, PC, and Wii U. That's right, a Wii U version of this game exists, created by Straight Right, which is the development studio that created the port of Mass Effect 3 for Wii U. The director's cut of Human Revolution features improved graphics engine, improved lighting, enemy AI, some bug fixes, also most notably some boss fight improvements. It includes the Missing Link DLC, and approximately 8 hours of director's commentaries and a 45-minute making of video, which was certainly interesting to watch for this project. It also had second screen functions, not only for the Wii U gamepad, but also PlayStation Vita and Xbox Smart Glass. Yes, remember that time of having 2 screens for your video game.
I forgot Smart Glass existed. I forgot that this game came out on Wii U. I forgot that Mass Effect 3 came out on Wii U.
Kind of amazing when you all piece it together, right? So, this game was developed by Eidos Montreal and published by Square Enix. What is Deus Ex Human Revolution? It is a first or third-person shooter, depending on the situations that you're in, with a stealth-first emphasis on gameplay. Of course, then it can devolve into a shooter, of course. But also the big deal is that it has role-playing elements. So I generally think of it like it's a Metal Gear Solid-like game, but with a whole bunch of choices to shape how you tell this story. What is that story? The year is 2027, which is 25 years before the setting of the original Deus Ex game. Instead of the nanotechnology that is in Deus Ex, it is now the onset of mechanical augmentation of the human body that is the real thing to grapple with in this world of Deus Ex. The player is ex-SWAT officer Adam Jensen. Who didn't ask for this? He is employed as a security officer for Seraph Industries, which is a leading augmentation company at this time in Detroit, Michigan.
Hey.
So you think of that connection where I'm near Detroit, Michigan, and I think of that and Detroit Become Human. It's like, oh, they really ran with the whole, Detroit will be the center of, mechanical development in the future. We'll see if that ends up being true. Especially with 2027. A little scary for a game that came out in 2011 to think like, yeah, that's the future. And now we're here in 2020. It's like, oh, that's real close. Damn.
They missed the part where I don't get to go to the grocery store, though.
Jeez. Yeah, that's true. So at Seraph Industries, there happens to be an attack on this facility where a group of heavily armed Black Ops soldiers attacks the company. They kill someone close to Adam and brutally injure Adam in the process. Adam Jensen awakens 6 months later to find that he is now full of these human mechanical augmentations that Seraph produces, including 2 cybernetic arms. Now, as a means of revenge or just to find out what's going on, Adam will have to unravel a web of conspiracies to find out just who did this to him, because after all, he never asked for this. So, can Adam hunt down the group known as the Tyrants? And what will he choose to do when it comes to how to address the ethics of human augmentation? Joe, this is where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Deus Ex Human Revolution?
Basically, nothing. I think I watched an LP of it years ago, but I've never played it. I know very little about it outside of the "he never asked for this" meme. And that's pretty much where I know that's cyberpunk, and that's basically where my familiarity ends.
I think that's about the same for me. It's a game I own, not only the original version, but also the director's cut version on Steam. But yeah, I've never played it. And my biggest familiarity with it is, oddly enough, the Pandora music channel, Video Game Music Radio, where they like to play several songs from this soundtrack. And I've talked about that with the Mass Effect series and Gears of War. And this is another game where it's a popular rotation item, certain tracks in particular, on that Pandora music channel. So I knew it's a soundtrack I really liked the sound of, that I wanted to eventually learn more about and talk about on this show. But besides my knowledge of, oh yeah, it's like Metal Gear, but cyberpunk, that's about it as far as my experience with the game. And it's really a game that dives into that idea of human augmentation, with the story exploring themes of transhumanism, the growing power of megacorporations, and their impact on social class. So like any good cyberpunk setting. Also a whole bunch of conspiracy theories, again, because that just falls in line. Oh, there's the Illuminati involved with Deus Ex. It's just kind of a thing. So this game started development and was announced in 2007 as Deus Ex 3, which was the first project for a new studio at the time, Eidos Montreal. Ultimately, the development team involved 83 people, and there's a whole lot of pressure to deliver with a new Deus Ex game. Apparently, a whole bunch of fans online, the forums, were rabid for new information about a new Deus Ex game. And so, a lot of pressure involved, certainly, but also a lot of developers left their nice jobs, safe jobs at other studios to come work on this game because it was a passion project for them. Big enthusiasts and fans of the Deus Ex games. And so taking a lot of risk to come work on it over several years. Apparently, the most difficult period for the development team was really the first 2 years of the project, not only establishing themselves as a studio, but to prove the concepts of the game to investors in these like quarterly meetings where they had to create like a vertical slice of the game concepts, essentially trying to show off this piece of the Human Revolution game, or at the time, the Deus Ex 3 project, that they wanted to represent the quality of the final project before they expanded out to the rest of the game. Risky, but it gets the investors on board and pays the bills and allows the project to continue. Because this was a prequel, though, the whole idea for the game really falls under the idea of the cyber renaissance. Before, the modernity that we enjoy today, there was the idea of the Renaissance period, like back in Italy with Da Vinci and understanding how the human body worked. Well, what if that worked for these human cyber augmentations? And so then before the idea of the 2052 setting with nanotechnology and Deus Ex, there has to be something that came before, and that's the setting here for Deus Ex Human Revolution. Instead of the cold blue color theming of most sci-fi projects, especially that runs rampant in Deus Ex, they kind of went with the opposite here, and there are a lot of warm tones, yellows, oranges, really dominates the visual theming of this game. Like orange and black is just like all over the place.
Yeah, that much I know from just seeing screenshots of this game. It is all orange and black. I've seen some people refer to it as the piss filter. I'm mixed on it personally, but I mean, it does its job.
Deus Ex Human Revolution derived plenty of inspirations from not only other games, but other types of media. On the game side, specifically noting Rainbow Six Vegas for the cover system and tactical combat, Fear for the design of the AI, BioShock for the interlinking of weapon and obstacle types, the Call of Duty series for the regenerating health system, Resident Evil 4 for multiple aspects, including the inventory system, game economy, and contextual actions, Metal Gear Solid for the AI and the alert systems, I'd say just as well as the stealth as well, and the Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay for the apparently general organic feel of the stealth. There's also the tabletop RPG Shadowrun that was big for influencing the hacking mechanics. Other references for, I'd say particularly the narrative theming, include The Children of Men for capturing the setting and resultant chaotic drama. BioShock gave them a reference for handling mature themes, while the television series Rome showed how powerful people's ambitions shaped history. Obviously, you have the X-Men franchise for the tensions between normal humans and mutants, those who either don't want or augmentations didn't take, or those who do have augmentations. For the conspiracy elements of the plot, the team used novels Deception Point, The Firm, and the Dune Saga, and the desired quality of cutscenes and dialogue were directly inspired by the Grand Theft Auto and Mass Effect franchises. At a certain point, the development was going up against this deadline so close that the development of the boss battles were outsourced to this other company called Grip Entertainment. The story and the gameplay feel really took the priority, and the battles for these bosses would not have been completed in time. They wondered if they could cut them, but they were so interwoven into the story that they needed to be done. And it's probably why for the initial release that these boss battles were seen as weak points, because it was a whole other company doing the work. One of their points of pride that they mentioned in this behind-the-scenes documentary is that they got to demo Human Revolution for Deus Ex creator Warren Spector at Gamescom 2010, who said that it looked and sounded like a true Deus Ex. And so that gave the team all the inspiration they needed to push forward and finish the game. And I can only imagine that's got to be very inspiring.
That has to be a really big morale booster of like, oh, good. The original guy likes it. Oh, I imagine a lot of tension was released.
Yeah, we're doing the right thing. We're going to see it through. And the game received critical acclaim with Metacritic scores of 90 for the PC version and 89 for the PS3 and 360 version. The world creation, the art design, the writing, and the soundtrack were praised, while the enemy AI and boss battles were criticisms. The game sold 2.18 million copies as of September 2011, and I can only imagine more since then with the director's cut. They did a nice thing where if you owned the game, at least on the PC version, you could get the director's cut for much less of a price if you had the original Human Revolution. The game was nominated for Best Music, Best Strategy Game, Best Action Game, and Best Story at the BAFTAs for that year. The score was also nominated for its music at the Spike Video Game Awards, the Hollywood Music and Media Awards, and the Canadian Video Game Awards. Its legacy includes some mobile spin-off games, including Deus Ex The Fall from 2013 and Deus Ex Go from 2016. The Go series, a really neat and clever one, a little puzzle navigating around a board from Square Enix there, from multiple series. Hitman Go, Tomb Raider Go, Deus Ex Go. There was a full-fledged sequel in Deus Ex Mankind Divided that released August 2016 on PC, PS4, and Xbox One. Reviews for that game in general were a little more mixed than Human Revolution. Also, the marketing was just plagued with problems, including misappropriations of racial events or slogans, a 5-tier pre-order system, and a microtransaction-heavy console experience. If you're wondering if there will be Deus Ex games in the future, Eidos Montreal since has worked on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and currently they're working on Marvel's Avengers. So I don't think the Deus Ex series is in doubt per se. The main team is just busy. But this also represents another video game that is another example of a Hollywood film announced that is in development hell. CBS Films apparently has the screen rights, and they announced a Human Revolution film adaptation in July 2012. But no progress has been made on this, despite some wanting like a Square Enix movie universe, especially after the Hitman films. So probably not going to happen there.
Yeah, I feel like it's safe to assume that if a studio announced a movie right after the game came out and then it's still not out, it's not happening. It's just not happening.
Yeah, we'll see when the Uncharted movie ever happens. I feel like that's the bellwether. I mean, I know you like Sly Cooper, right? But Uncharted is probably the biggest one right now.
Yeah, I still don't think that movie's ever going to happen. It's kind of a miracle that Monster Hunter movie is happening, even though it looks awful.
So let's talk about the music in Deus Ex Human Revolution, which is very different than Where the Water Tastes Like Wine.
Boy, is it.
The Human Revolution composer is Michael McCann, who was born March 5th, 1976 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He is also known as Behavior, as one of his solo project names. He got into music at a really young age. He says mainly just learning songs by ear and playing them on various instruments around the house. Primarily piano is what he started with. He says he started a band with some friends at about age 13, and after a few live shows, he started to realize that he didn't like playing live. So what did he do with music from there? He started writing music for stage plays and short films. Then he went to do his own albums in his early 20s. Then on to sound design or music editing for feature films. Then into scoring TV series, indie features, games, documentaries, and advertising. He said he wanted to work in as many mediums and as many genres as possible. So how did he get into games? He says the first game gig came from actually his solo album. He wrote material and published it. That ended up getting him in touch with an agent. And then that music ended up at Ubisoft for them to consider for a possible pitch for their next game project. He says he doesn't think that they would have given him the option to pitch at all if he didn't have any released music. So if he had any recommendations for musicians out there, he really wants people to like develop their own voice and really develop their own brand of music, because then whatever they make not only stands out or possibly could stand out in the industry, but also you don't feel like you're trying to emulate someone else's style. And when it's all yours, that really makes you feel rewarded for your own music. Just, putting that out there. So in his spare time, he listens to a lot of old blues, opera, experimental ambient music, hip hop, pop punk, and just a whole lot of film scores. He is inspired by those film scores and film directors like Michael Mann, Stanley Kubrick, Alfred Hitchcock, Akira Kurosawa, John Ford, and Ingmar Bergman. After his most recent project, he said at a panel that he wants to move on from cyberpunk-like music and try something very different. I feel like it's been a niche of his for the certain games that he's worked on, and you'll kind of see kind of a theming here for a while. And so good for him to go on and try something different. I'm very interested to follow his continued career, which you can follow him on Twitter at McCann_BHVR. So what is his discography like? When he started working on those featured films as a sound designer or a music editor, they were films like Fubar and It's All Gone Pete Tong, which are apparently cult hits in Canada and the UK. As far as those video games go, obviously Deus Ex Human Revolution and its sequel Mankind Divided, but that Ubisoft project was Splinter Cell Double Agent. He also worked for 2K games for several projects, including XCOM Enemy Unknown, XCOM 2, and he was most recently one of the 4 composers on Borderlands 3. Some historical development research on the Deus Ex Human Revolution soundtrack. McCann worked on the score off and on from about 2008 to spring 2011. He handled production, performance, mixing, and arranging on the project. Again, not doing any live things, just kind of staying in his own bubble and pumping out that music. Additional arrangements were also done by Francois Arbor and Eric Arvise. Vocals were provided by Andrea Revelle and Courtney Wing. The project originally started out in 2008 as a very electronic score, and when you're trying to follow Deus Ex, a famous far future cyberpunk game, yeah, it's gonna be electronic. But when McCann read the game's script to understand the narrative themes at play, and this idea of cyber renaissance came up, he decided to add more acoustic, organic elements over time. And so this idea of transhumanism really influenced the score, because he thought each instrument should be influenced by electronic music in some way, whether it's effects or different plugins or whatnot. And so these are all virtual instruments, but there are some that are definitely like started out as organic acoustic instruments, just tweaked by electronics, which again, really smart theming, makes a whole lot of sense. Apparently the musical structure was defined by McCann as 3-sided. I guess there's a thematic use of triangles in this game, especially when you see like the title and one of the A's, I think in Human Revolution, is a triangle. His 3 musical elements, in this case being acoustics, like vocals or strings, which represent the past, electronic music, that represents the future, and the present being a mixture of the two in both style and instrumentation. When you also think about it, there also needs to be ambient, tense, and active variations of all of these sort of samples and themes here. So again, triangles. It's a pretty decently sized game, so there are almost about 200 pieces of music in the score. McCann says, quote, "Because we approach the music more as atmosphere, relying more on harmony, rhythm, and mood, instead of melody, it meant trying to find the emotional core in a very dense wall of sound." Some of the influences for this music, McCann said, on the electronic side, there was an influence from John Carpenter and Tangerine Dream scores, as well as Vangelis's work. On the acoustic side, there was a strong influence from Lisa Gerrard, Dead Can Dance, Ennio Morricone, and Elliot Goldenthal, mainly in terms of textures/mood, rather than actual musical concepts. Outside of movies, Massive Attack, Amon Tobin, Ben Lucas Boyson, Aphex Twin, and Brian Eno were all strong influences. Michael McCann was actually based out of Montreal during development, which certainly made things interesting for Eidos Montreal. He says, there were definitely times when I could run down the street about 5 blocks away to the studio to see how the music was working in the game and to see the progress of the game, both visually and audio-wise. But if it's coming off of this classic Deus Ex game, how could they include references to the original game? Do you include melodies from the original game into the score? Well, not necessarily. Apparently, the idea was that there is a pirate radio station that you can hear while playing throughout the game. And the music for this radio station is apparently all from the first Deus Ex game. You can occasionally hear it when you're like walking through a room or an alleyway where an NPC might have it on. And the music for Deus Ex Human Revolution spreads apparently far and wide, including the main menu theme being featured in a trailer for the Will and Jaden Smith film After Earth. Not a great film.
That is an unfortunate connection to have.
But the trailer, I think it's trailer number 2, the first little bit, it's like, oh yeah, oh that's music from this game. It's always weird to hear that, right? I felt like I was watching, when I first saw Captain America the Winter Soldier in theaters, I saw they had like some sort of preview for the series Penny Dreadful. And right in this preview, like, that's Clint Mansell's Leaving Earth piece from Mass Effect 3. What is this doing in here? So it's always amazing to see how sometimes these pieces can get reappropriated, and all the better to have the composers make those royalties, I suppose. So what does the music to Deus Ex Human Revolution sound like with the electronics, with the acoustic instruments that also all get blended together? Sounds very different than Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, I'll tell you that much. We have to start the first critical track, the main one that I feel like everyone has to identify with from this game. It is Icarus, main theme. I feel like if you have heard anything from the Deus Ex Human Revolution soundtrack, it's probably this theme. Not only is Icarus the main theme for the game, it was also used in the game's E3 2010 trailer, where it's the big cinematic CGI reveal for like the story and all that. Square Enix's Visual Studio team worked on that trailer, and so it really had a nice polish to it. But because it was for this trailer, this gave Michael McCann more time to work on this song in particular. And he had about 2 months to work on it. It apparently started as like kind of a bare bones thing, but ultimately, to combine all these ideas together, the song uses about 30 instruments together. And I think it's these alternating synths, the dung 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 dung, and then the strings coming in, just like perfectly encapsulates that idea of blending the electronic with the acoustic. And then you have the vocals come in. That kind of echoes the idea of the Renaissance theming with some like religious overtones in there. But of course, the idea of Icarus is a big theme for the game, especially with the parallel to the Greek myth of Icarus, where Icarus was flying with artificial wings, yet flew too close to the sun and destroyed his wings, causing his fatal fall. So yeah, a great theme that if you needed to hear one track from this soundtrack, it's this one for sure.
It sounds familiar. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've heard it before. Where that would have been, I guess I did say I watched an LP. So I might have heard it there. It is very, very cool. The fusion with like the acoustic stuff and the electronic stuff is really well done. And not something I actually noticed until you brought up that was one of McCann's main goals with the soundtrack. Yeah, I think it fits really well. It's a super awesome song.
Yeah, it's definitely a big one. Number 2 on the Critical 5. This is Detroit City Ambient, Part 1. It's always weird, right? Is the title ambient, and then you have the ambiance? I don't know. It's French developers. What can you say? So this song really is creating that mood, especially when it is all about the ambiance. In this case, for Detroit specifically, it's dark, and it reflects the lawlessness and the surrounding decay of this city of Seraph Industries that has really built it up and developed. I feel like it's more chill than some of the other pieces we're going to hear here today, but it really establishes the theming well for what is the first main hub area of the game before you eventually go to China. And it's neat. I like that this represents Detroit, especially in a 2027 future. So it kind of resonates well with me, but I feel like it's just an important kind of starting area, and you kind of get these cues here.
There's really big Mass Effect tones to it.
Mm-hmm.
To me, like I get a really big feeling of Mass Effect to this one. You can really hear the inspiration on that. Yeah, it's real good. It is a lot chiller than the other stuff that I've listened to today for the first time. So I think it works out real well as a bit of a down before we go back up.
I feel like also with the Metal Gear scores, this is another great soundtrack to just listen to on walks and like just in your headphones, playing through your phone, whatever. And yeah, just embracing the mood that it creates.
I could hear that.
And whether you feel, cool walking around, unnerved, like a badass, like really sets these tones nicely.
Yeah.
If you want to feel like a badass, you're going to put on number 3 here on the Critical 5, The Hive. You are in this Hengsha area of China. You are walking through a nightclub that is owned by the Triads. And yeah, just feeling like a badass. Such a cool song. Definitely one that I remember hearing from that Pandora station, specifically for those vocals. And those vocals are unlike anything you're going to hear in most games or even on this soundtrack, but these vocals directly reference apparently a well-known Vietnamese song, and the title here, Ca Dao Em Va Toi. I butchered that, I'm sure, but plenty of YouTube comments seem to suggest that is where that melody comes from. And in the future, maybe Vietnam is part of China. Who knows? Hengsha is apparently like Shanghai repurposed to this island area. So it's like future expansion in a way.
This is definitely among my favorites on your Critical 5. I think the next one narrowly beats it out, but I think those vocals really, really add a really cool bit to it. And it does sound like if you were walking around to this music, you'd feel like a badass, especially with the whole Triads. I've dealt with the Triads in Yakuza before. I know what they're like. I don't know what they're like in real life, and I'd rather I'd prefer not to ever find out.
Yeah, please keep me away from that as well. So let's talk about that next track on the Critical 5. Number 4, this is Hengsha Daylight, Part 1. This is the ambiance for that Hengsha environment. It's like the second big hub world in the game. McCann wanted to create a mood here of light and wealth and just the architecture of this area of the world. He said, I tried to incorporate street musicians, music from cafes, city ambiance, and any sound that might exist in the environment into the score. I feel like not only does this kind of capture the mood of the other big environment of the game, but also even, YouTube commenters were pointing this out, like, listen to the whole piece on this one and listen to it with really good headphones, because like it's a big headphone soundscape mood that this track goes places, whether it's light and airy or with that intense cyberpunk feel. And it's just great to hear in those cans.
Yeah, like I said in the last track, this is my favorite track on the Critical 5. Because it's the intense part where I'm really just, I was listening for the first time and it really just hit me of like, oh yeah, this is good. This is good. I don't know much more about it. It's kind of more of the cool vocals, though not really in the same vein as the last song. And just in general, this song just feels really cool.
Number 5 on the Critical 5 kind of wraps things up, though. This is Namir. And it's definitely the back part of this track, the one I pulled for the clip, that is really a standout on this one. I believe this plays during the final boss battle, if my research was correct here. Though the version of this song that was on the soundtrack says trailer edit in parentheses. So it may not be exactly what was in the game, but I feel like McCann really summed this soundtrack up best, where he personally thinks that there are 4 cues that represent what the music is trying to do in the game. He says the main theme, that'd be Icarus, one of the ambient cues from Detroit, one of the ambient cues from Hengsha, and one of the big boss fight cues, being Namir. So I feel like some may appreciate other boss battle cues. There's one called Everybody Lies. I think it's where you battle Yelena Fedorova. It's another one that I almost had on here because I did like the sound of it too. But if this is like more important to what the composer thinks represents the soundtrack best, who am I to argue? And honestly, it's just a great chorus, especially in the clip that we used here. Just a great full culmination of all these games themes and just the mashing together of all these styles.
It is really cool and definitely feels like the fusion of Metal Gear and Mass Effect that we have mentioned, that in a lot of ways this game kind of is, along with a bunch of other stuff. You listed like 6 or 7 games that they took inspiration from.
Yeah.
And they mix really well. And I think this song is, as on top of being a great culmination of the game's themes, just a great culmination of all of its inspirations sort of packed into one and then turned into something unique as a result.
So when it comes to tracks on the cutting room floor, Joe, you have one. Hit me with it.
I have one because I accidentally wandered into it when I was listening to the Critical 5 for the first time, and I didn't go to the right track, and I went to the wrong track on accident. And that song that I heard really stuck out to me. It is called Harvesters. I don't know where this song plays. I don't know what context it plays in. I do know that, like I said, when I heard it, I kind of had this whole moment of like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. It's got some similar themes to The Hive, I think, because it was the song that came right after The Hive. That's how I ended up hearing it. And after listening to it a little bit, I was just like, yeah, I gotta put this on the cutting room floor. I think this is really good.
Yeah, I think Harvesters are enemies that are based in the Hive in Hengsha. So yeah, probably tied with them. My 2 tracks on the cutting room floor, one of them is Singapore Ambient Part 2. I guess you also go to Singapore for maybe a mission or 2. This is another one that I'm familiar with from Pandora, so I don't think it's necessarily a critical track, especially for the composer's vision, but it's one that I am familiar with from multiple listens from that streaming music service, and I really just like how it's these high-pitched synths that just cut through the low ambiance and just gives it a good sense of atmosphere. I like that one a lot. The other one, though, is Hunghua Brothel. And if that's stirring something inside you, look, for a game that some people mock as being pronounced Deus Ex, the eroticism of this one is quite high. Like, wow. So, you're welcome if you want to add it to some playlists out there. Because that one struck some chords, let's just say.
I've been broken because I can't hear songs that play in this kind of like setting and not think of the strip club dungeon in Persona 4.
Yeah, obviously.
It's the only thing that ever I'm like, this would play in that dungeon. And then I'm like, strip clubs exist in real life, me. What?
They need music for those environments.
I mean, I wouldn't know. I've never been to one. I don't know.
What will I never forget about Deus Ex Human Revolution? Adam Jensen? You didn't ask for this. I'm sorry, I hate to go back to the meme, but it's like...
That puts the count at like 6.
Whenever you think about it, like that's what you gotta mention, right? Now, I think that it's like, I honestly should play it, especially with how much I like the soundtrack. Michael McCann did a great job. I loved learning about this, but especially if I like playing Metal Gear Solid games where you're playing Metal Gear Solid for Smasterpieces for your other podcast, it's like a Western take on that, I think, and it'd be very interesting to compare and grapple with the ethics of human mechanical augmentation.
See, I've never had a huge amount of interest in playing Deus Ex because, funnily enough, despite being a pretty big Metal Gear fan, I've found that I don't like stealth games that much. I don't have the patience for them. If you have been watching my streams of Metal Gear Solid, you will know that I'm not good at being stealthy. I'm the least stealthy person in the world. My idea of stealth is, oh man, that guy saw me. Well, time to punch every single guard in the building. So just Deus Ex is never really, I know that a lot of people really love it. And I know that it is like up there in those games of like, oh, it's modern classics. The original is one of those, and Human Revolution is honestly put on that list quite a bit as well. And it's just never stuck out to me as something that I personally want to play. I don't know why.
It was amazing to go through the YouTube comments and see just how many people praise it as like one of their favorite games of the time, or even like ever for some people. So it was really good to see. And I'm glad I did the research for this. I'm really happy with that. But yes, it was two incredibly different games. Let's be real. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and Deus Ex Human Revolution. Sorry, also a long podcast title. 2 long titles makes a very long podcast title.
Oh God, I didn't even think about that. There's no way we can shorten it either.
But very, very different soundtracks, but great ones nonetheless. And that'll do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at PeteSpeakEasy. Joe is over at The Dobaga. The video version of the show is on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, also at rhymeswithasia.com. But it's that MP3 podcast version that you want, hosted by Anonymous Dinosaur at anondino.squarespace.com. Also, that MP3 podcast version can be found on podcast storefronts all around the globe. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, wherever you find your podcast. Take it with you on a run at work if you're going to work during these times. And yeah, we still won't tell your boss that you're listening to great video game soundtracks, whether you're working at work or from home.
I also won't tell your kids. They won't hear it from me. Don't worry.
You can also find the Original Soundchat podcast feed on Spotify. But not only that, we have a Spotify playlist that if we talk about a song on the show and it's on Spotify, it's going on that playlist. Joe, are we adding any new songs this week?
Both of these soundtracks are available on Spotify, far as I could tell. I know Water Wine, which is how I've been referring to it shorthand, is on Spotify for sure. And when I was searching for Deus Ex, as far as I can tell, all of your tracks are on there. So both games are getting added to the playlist this week for the first time in months.
All right. Perfect. And yeah, Square Enix does generally a very good job with that. So that's super good to see. Hopefully some more bonus track work this period of working from home. So hopefully we'll turn some things around soon, especially when semesters start to wane and peter out. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Ashley Barrett.
Sounds like a super giant game there for sure. I will be talking about Hiroki Kikuta. All right. So to play us out, I got to talk about a cover of Icarus. It's the main theme, right? You got to talk about it. I found a piano cover of the song. This comes from YouTuber Symbiose Piano. So I hope you enjoy this cover of Icarus. Thank you so much for listening this week on Original Soundchat. We'll see you next time. Take care.